Alexander married his brother's wife, who was this Salome Alexander, after his brother died. So Alexander was the youngest of the three brothers. He survived. And the point is that this Salome Alexander was a brother of one of the famous Pharisee teachers. His name was Simeon ben Shetach. Simeon ben a sister rather. Her brother was this Simeon ben Shetach. And so he is in the rabbinic literature one of the Pharisee pairs that leads down to Rabbi Yochanan and others. So this is a very important Pharisee family that she comes from. And she really has a lot of influence. She outlives Alexander too. So here we get the problem of Alexander from 100 to about 70 BC having to fight this Demetrius, who has been invited into the country. Here it is: Demetrius the victor was deserted by those who called him in, whereas through sympathy for men my translation is bad, who had, who had beaten Alexander. After fleeing to the hills, Alexander was joined by 6,000 Jews. So once again, like Judas, 2 generations later, Alexander takes to the hills, just like Judas did. Alexander Onias, this is. And it looks like there's a Qumran document also mentioning him at one point. Again, these are probably later documents. Paean to King Jonathan, it's called, which shows that the Qumran people liked this guy. They write a paean to him, a poem of praise. So they obviously seem to, so the Maccabeans and the scrolls cannot be the wicked priests in the way it is supposedly theorized by most Dead Sea Scroll experts. So the whole nation, therefore, changed their minds and flocked to his standard. So in the end, nationalism is the popular emotion that always wins the day. So when the foreign powers look like they're going to defeat Alexander, all the people flock to his standard, and he is able to keep independence and expel the Seleucids for the time being. But he was so enraged that he proceeded to impiety from brutality. That's what the Nahum Pesher says about the furious young lion. He was impious in this act. 800 prisoners he impaled in the middle of the city, crucified if you like, hung up alive, then butchered their wives and children before their eyes. Now that is a pretty atrocious event, but he was really worked up about the treachery and so on and so forth. So that's Alexander Onias. He died after reigning 27 years, but his wife Alexandra succeeds him still. Now here is the tragic moment for Jewish history, right here. Alexandra, through Alexander Onias, has, as usual, 2 sons. An older, Hyrcanus, and a younger, Aristobulus. Aristobulus, obviously named after the brother that we mentioned earlier that was killed, the son of John Hyrcanus. Let me see if I can find a place to put this. Here we are. Let's see. Okay. So we have Alexander Onias. So now he has 2 sons through Alexander. Hyrcanus, this would be Hyrcanus 2. Why Hyrcanus 2? Because John Hyrcanus is Hyrcanus 1. And Aristobulus, also the name of Alexander's brother who died before him. Maybe that was his wife. You'll have to read it more carefully than I'm reading it here with you. In any case, here is where the Herodians are going to be introduced. Here is where the Pharisees are going to be introduced. Here is where the, what's that? Is that me or someone else? Not me, I don't think. Here is where the Pharisees are going to be introduced. And here is the tragic moment for Jewish national independence. Here's where the Romans are going to come into the picture. So let's move down to these 2 sons. Alexandra, confident that the Jews would readily submit to her, since by her freedom from any trace of brutality and constant opposition to Alexander's excesses, she gained the goodwill of the people. She had an extraordinary reputation for piety. She was very particular in her observance of national custom, meaning national law, and offenders against the holy law, etc., etc., etc. Of the two sons she bore Alexander, she appointed the elder Hyrcanus high priest, in view of his age and natural disinclination to interfere in state affairs. The younger Aristobulus, who was more impulsive, she kept out of public eye. Sort of like the Old Testament, the youngers always supplant the olders. It turns out that Aristobulus is the popular person. We'll call him Aristobulus II because there was already an Aristobulus in the previous generation. By the way, the Hebrew name of these Aristobuluses is Judith. They're Judas Aristobulus. They have a Greek name and a Hebrew name. So here are the two brothers. We're around 70s, 60s BC. The Romans are expanding, as we know, since the days of Daniel in the Eastern Mediterranean. Pompey and the triumvirate is coming down through Turkey or Asia Minor and Syria. So what happens here? But while she ruled others, the Pharisees ruled her. There you are. She's a Pharisee puppet or whatever. And the Pharisees are now mentioned by name. Thus, an eminent man who was a friend of Alexander was put to death by them on the charge of having abetted the king of impaling 800 citizens. You see, the Pharisees are taking vengeance on the associates of Alexander. They then pressed Alexander to execute the rest of those who had incited Alexander against them. So it definitely is the Pharisees who Alexander executes, and who also, by implication, invited foreign power, Demetrius, into the country, the same way the previous ones had done in Alchemus' time. This we'll find is typical of the Pharisee behavior. Later on in 37 BC, when Herod comes, the Pharisees recommend opening the gates to Herod. Later on, when the war against Rome begins, the Pharisees invite the Roman troops into the city. This is repeated over and over again. It is not the popular way, because the popular way is the resistance way. It is the way of survival. Josephus calls himself a Pharisee. Paul calls himself a Pharisee. Everyone calls himself a Pharisee who wants to survive, but it is not the resistance way. Okay, so she let this happen, and they killed whoever they wanted. That is, the Pharisees killed whoever they want in vengeance of what Alexander did. Now, Aristobulus, and in the course of these things,